All right, we're going to spend the next 10 minutes or so talking about contracts and negotiations. And, of course, we're going to focus exclusively on the work side now. But what you heard earlier today about work-life balance is, no question, absolutely necessary and important in your careers. Of course, I obviously do have a financial interest in the materials. I've been advising physicians, a lot of young ophthalmologists for the last nearly 25 years on physician employment agreements, partnership agreements, etc. All right. Well, even before we talk about the contract, the employment agreement between you and the practice that will employ you, we need to talk about the practice itself. And we need to talk about, is this the right practice for you? Is this the right fit for you? I was meeting with someone yesterday, one of your colleagues, who said he's looked at 5 or 6 different practices, and now he's honed in on the one that he really wants to pursue. So how do you do that? Well, you do that through answering questions such as, are you personally compatible with the other ophthalmologists or physicians in the group? And the only way you're going to learn about that is by having a dialogue with those physicians. It might require 1 or 2 or even 3 interviews in some cases before you really get a good feel as to whether this is the right fit for you. Do you share the same core values with those you'll be working with and for? And that's a real important question. You know, there are some practices that make work-life balance #1 practice goal, and there are others, quite frankly, that are all about the work, all about maximizing income for the practice. There are also some strategic considerations that you have to consider as you look at the practice. Is the practice aligned with the right hospitals and healthcare systems? And you may be saying, why is that even relevant? I'm rarely going to use the hospital, what have you. How is that important? Well, nowadays we have accountable care organizations, we have physician hospital organizations, and a lot of other entities that are being created that will contract with managed care plans or with other insurance products that are out there. So it will be important to know whether you're joining the practice that does indeed have a strong relationship or has a relationship with the strongest hospitals in that market. And on a similar note, are you potentially locked out of any managed care plans? You may be the best cataract surgeon to ever go through training, but unless that managed care plan has a need for you, and unless that practice has a contract with that managed care plan, you may not be able to access it. All right, important to know, what are the practice's objectives in hiring you? When I get a call from a potential client, this is one of the first questions I ask. And here's just a couple of responses that you might hear. One is to replace a retiring shareholder, and another is to replace an associate who was terminated or left suddenly from the practice. And why does that matter? Because the answer to that question may indicate the ability that you or your advisor has to negotiate your employment agreement. So what I would say, for example, if you're replacing a retiring shareholder, then very likely that shareholder gave 12 or even 18 or 24 months notice before of his retirement. And that gives the practice a lot of time to plan. So perhaps in that situation, you may find that you really have very little room to negotiate. On the other hand, if the associate is left suddenly or was terminated for cause, that may indeed give you or your advisor a lot more negotiating clout. All right, as we move to some of the mechanics here, compensation, salaries, bonuses, fringe benefits, it's all the good stuff, of course. We find that salaries, starting salaries, will vary greatly across the country and from market to market. What you may be offered for a position in Boston or LA may be very different from what you may be offered for a position in rural Nebraska, for example. We also find that starting salaries tend to vary also depending upon the bonus structure. Is there a bonus in the practice? And we're going to look at that in just a moment. And then the third point here, fringe benefits. We find that fringe benefits do not vary significantly from market to market. And what are we talking about here? What's a fringe benefit? It's things like health insurance, life insurance, disability insurance, CME, anything that the practice is paying for you. So if you think of compensation in a broad sense, it can include salaries, what you receive as your compensation for provision of services, but it also includes the value of your fringe benefits. Now, I mentioned bonuses a moment ago, and bonuses can be structured in many different ways. I've listed just 3 up here. One is, and this is the most common one, an individual bonus threshold approach. And typically the practice will look at what the direct costs are of employing you, meaning your salary and the cost of the fringe benefits. They'll then allocate a full share of overhead to you, and that will then result in some bonus threshold, some dollar amount of collections. If we kind of back into that number, very often we find that it runs between 2 times and 3 times your base salary, with that range depending upon the overhead rate in the practice. And by overhead rate, I mean for every dollar the practice collects, how much of it goes to the running of the practice before there's any compensation to the ophthalmologists or optometrists or any other providers in the practice. The second model that we see in other employment agreements is what I would call a criteria-based discretionary bonus. And that means the practice may include several criteria in your employment agreement, and it says that this is the basis on which you will or will not receive a bonus. And just a couple of examples here. Have you been successful in developing new referral relationships for the practice? You know, we recognize that physicians refer to other physicians for a lot of different reasons. Some of it is age, of course, and you often find that contemporaries refer to their contemporaries. So that's an important criterion. And then the other one listed here, patient satisfaction. You know, in the old days, and I've been around since the old days, we didn't measure patient satisfaction. This is a fairly new phenomenon. Some of the managed care plans will actually measure patient satisfaction. Some hospitals measure it. So this might be a criterion in your employment agreement. And then the third option here is simply a purely discretionary model or bonus model that has no criteria associated. There's no dollar amount, no percentage or anything like that. Totally up to the practice. And what are some common mistakes that I see young physicians, not only ophthalmologists, but in other specialties make? Well, very often you tend to overlook the small markets, these rural markets or secondary markets, and some mid-sized markets in favor of the larger urban areas. But we often find that these larger urban areas are oversaturated with physicians in a particular specialty, and that may or may not be the best place for you. Another mistake I find is that some of your colleagues will concentrate on starting salary alone as opposed to the total package that's being offered to you. And by package, I mean all of these components of compensation, the base salary, the bonus, and the value of your fringe benefits. We looked at the bonus threshold in just a moment ago, but very often when I read an agreement, I find that it fails to specify the precise mechanics as to how the bonus will be computed. So if there is ambiguity about that, the best thing we want to do is we want to ask for an example using some real numbers. And then lastly, a mistake that's made is failing to understand how patient assignment can affect compensation or affect your bonus. The more of your bonus that's dependent upon, or the more of your compensation that's dependent upon bonus, the more important it'll be as to how you're assigned to patients, not just in terms of numbers of patients, but also in terms of the payer mix of those patients. And by that I mean perhaps commercially insured patients, the payers reimburse better, for example, than Medicaid patients. All right, what are some other employment issues in an employment agreement? And one of the major ones is termination. Now, none of us wants to think about termination. We always assume, well, I don't have to listen to anything about termination. That's never going to happen to me. That's going to happen to the next guy. But the reality is that for a variety of reasons, terminations do occur in ophthalmology practices. And so how can one be terminated? Well, of course, the employer can terminate without cause. There isn't any specific reason. It's just not a good fit. It's just not working out. The employer can also terminate with cause. And these are generally things that are black or white: loss of medical license, loss of malpractice insurance, etc. But sometimes other reasons sneak into the agreement. Things like, what if the agreement said you could be terminated for cause for failure to work harmoniously with others? Now, some of you may chuckle about that, but that actually comes from an employment agreement that I've reviewed. So we do want to understand those reasons why you can be terminated with or without cause. And similarly, you have the ability to terminate the agreement without cause. That's the same as a resignation. Now, the last type here, your ability to terminate with cause, is one that I don't often find in employment agreements. I will see it on some occasions, and perhaps that may be something you want to have included in the agreement. And what does that mean? It may mean that the practice has in some way materially breached the agreement. It says you were going to work at a particular location, but instead 6 months later now they say you're going to work at this other location that is not geographically useful for you. And there are consequences of termination. There are two areas that have the greatest consequences in terms of termination. One is with respect to malpractice insurance, and the other, restrictive covenants. With respect to malpractice insurance, often you'll have claims-made coverage, meaning you or someone has to buy the tail to cover your acts while you were employed. And then restrictive covenants, that's just a limitation on your ability to practice after you leave, and the enforceability of those differs greatly from state to state. Some other mistakes that are made, and we won't have time to cover them all, but if there's ambiguous language in the agreement, let's fix it. A mistake may be that you ignore the provisions about termination or malpractice insurance or the restrictive covenants. We do always want to address the buy-in up front, and the reason we do that is so it manages expectations on both sides, and typically up front you want to know, when am I eligible for buy-in, what are the criteria for buy-in, and how will the practice be valued at the time I buy in. Some common mistakes here, and this first one here is the major one, particularly if you're joining a solo physician in practice, waiting to discuss the buy-in until you've been with the practice several years. You want to have that pre-negotiated before you start with the practice. Some other questions that you want to ask during the interview process: how are the partners compensated? How does the buy-in formula relate to the buy-out formula? How will I ever participate in practice management if I become a partner? Last a couple slides here on negotiations. You always have to ask yourself the question of, do you want to negotiate or do you want to have someone do that for you? And the reason to use a third party, of course, is that they act as a buffer between you and the practice. This is all about negotiating a win-win, negotiating a relationship, not like buying a used car or a house. And just some final warning signs as you go through the process. If you hear any of these things, they're warning signs to you, and this may or may not be the right situation. And lastly, some final pearls of join the right practice for you. I like to say that starts with the people and ends with the contract. I can fix the contract, I can't fix the people. Understand the terms of the agreement, address the buy-in up front, focus on the long term, and recognize that you're negotiating a relationship, not a transaction. Thank you.